Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the Community Schools Leadership Summit. For some of you, this is day 1. This is your first day in attending, so let me introduce myself. My name is Gregory Butz, and I am an administrator in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But I'm also a member of the School Ambassador Fellowship with the United States Department of Education. The work that I do is in connection with the United States Department of Education priorities. And one of the things that they asked me to do is develop a capstone project that would be connected to the United States Department of Education's priorities and aligned with my own state's priorities. So that work actually began with focus groups with community school coordinators across New Mexico. It also began with focus groups of superintendents and other educators here in New Mexico. And as a result, a culmination of all that information, we put it together and we launched a Community Schools Leadership Summit, which is the first that this has ever occurred in the state. So before we begin, I wanted to give some special recognition to the people and organizations that have been so instrumental in launching this. I want to thank the members of the United States Department of Education who have lended their resources and time in helping prepare this. And also want to thank specifically the coalition that has formed as a result of this. ABC Community School Partnership, PED Communities in Schools New Mexico, Las Cruces Partnership for Community Schools, and the NEA New Mexico Center for Community Schools. In day 1, yesterday, some of the things that we covered, we began to look at collaborative leadership. We began to explore what that looked like. Principals received professional development in terms of blending and braiding their schools. We also looked at legal ramifications of certain landmark cases here in New Mexico. And we also began to have conversations as to what the collaboration, that shared leadership component would look like between the principal and the community school coordinator. As we closed the day yesterday, we also looked at the federal side of community schools. And we also realized that some of the grant work and funding can also be done collaboratively, as schools can partner together to apply for different fund work. So collaborative leadership is the key of this summit. And today, we're going to be looking at how we're going to implement some of those practices. So up on the screen, we have some of the objectives. We're going to analyze obstacles to collaborative leadership. We're going to identify multiple resources available to assist with that leadership, and we're going to expand communication and collaborative practices. And just as a rule of thumb, try to keep the camera on while you're in the sessions. And also, if you're not speaking and we have a speaker or presenter, please try to remember to keep your audio muted. So with that being said, we have some of the different keys to successful connection: camera on, mute the sound, be fully active and engaged, and honor the lived experiences. And if you're just joining and you see somebody speaking, my name again is Gregory Butz, and I will be guiding us through this process. We're going to get started. And I'm going to turn this over to Deanna to introduce our speaker and the media experience.
Great, good morning. Thank you, Greg, and welcome everybody. It's so nice to see you all back again this morning, and welcome to our new participants. Today, we have invited the community school coordinators to join us with their principals, and so we're really excited to see you all here. And we are going to start our day off by just setting our framework in why community schools and how community schools really impact families. And so the story that we're going to share with you is one of a community school coordinator here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Her name is Monique Mills, and She, up until just a couple weeks ago, was the community school coordinator at Grant Middle School. And I'm going to share a video of her story, and then she's going to step in and kind of add to that. But I want to just let you know that the video was produced by United Way of New Mexico. And they are one of the partners that sit on the ABC Community School Partnership Board. And so we're thankful to them for allowing us to share this video with you today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get that going. And then Monique, we'll hear from you as soon as it ends. Okay. All right. Let me just back this up.
The resilience that the kids and I have, a lot of it has come from support that we received through hard times, but a lot of it has come from each other. I don't think I could have gone through it without my kids, and vice versa, you know? I don't think that they could have gone through it without me. My life started to fall apart when their father, I found out that he was utilizing drugs. He wasn't coming with paychecks. I went to social services in North Carolina. I was living in a motel with 2 kids. It was very rough. Then I met someone in New Mexico. So I moved out here. We were together for probably about 10 years. 5 of those years, he apparently was cheating on me. He ended up getting violent, and my son witnessed it. That was it. Like, here we go again. Like, I gotta call it quits. I literally had my van. That was it. I took the kids in my van, and whatever was in there, as much as I tried to protect them from everything that they have seen, they did witness physical abuse. They witnessed mental abuse. They witnessed drug use, and it breaks my heart. The only saving grace in all of this is how close the kids and I have become. The only barrier they were not facing was love. No matter what's going on in your life, like, you can definitely get through it. It definitely builds a coat of armor. With the support of the community and the support of the school systems, that has helped us build resiliency with each other. I was part of a community school. I'd been volunteering there, and the whole point of a community school, you're supposed to go there if you need help with anything that would harbor or put a barrier in front of your kids' education. This was doing that. I went to the school and told them everything that was going on, and they were able to hook me up with resources that put us up into an extended stay place until we were able to get into an apartment. They continued to go to school. Nothing changed when it came to their learning. Everything was very seamless. Once that happened, I vowed that I wanted to be in that position. I wanted to be a community school coordinator. 5 years later, here I am. Through everything we were experiencing, I was still able to graduate with an associate's degree. It changed my life, and now I get to do that for someone else. Yeah, you can get through it. I've been there, you know. The ability for an organization like United Way to be able to come together and pull all of these resources together is really the key. If families are in need of any kind of resources that cause any kind of barriers for learning, we try to knock that barrier down. We want every family to succeed, and we want every child to succeed. And in order for the child to succeed, they have to be able to succeed at home too.
Do you want me to speak?
Go ahead, Monique.
I just wanted to add a little bit to that, and it's always hard to watch that video. I always cry my eyes out, so I really tried to hold it in there. But Deanna actually was the community school coordinator at Manzana Mesa when I was going through that situation. Now I'm gonna make her cry. So it just, what I wanted to really share with people is that the whole why of community schools is not just to help the kids. It does help the kids, but it really brings in the parents, it brings in family, and it makes them your family. I'm back here in Maryland with my family now, but I still feel like I have family in New Mexico because of community schools. And I don't ever want to leave that family. So hopefully I can continue that work out here and become a community school coordinator here in Maryland as well. I mean, look at the impact that community schools do for families. You know, I really was just a volunteer. Actually, I wasn't even a volunteer. I was just a parent at first. And I was in culinary school. And all I did was go on a field trip. I went on a field trip with my students and met Deanna. And that's when Homework Diner was starting. And she found out that we were part of, this is one of the things that coordinators do. They network all the time. So she found out that we were a culinary school and wanted to know if we wanted to help out with the Homework Diner. And that is history. Like, that totally was the connection that neither one of us knew we needed. But it definitely was something that lasted a decade and still holds strong. Even though I have left New Mexico, I don't feel like I've left community schools at all. And I think that that's something that a lot of parents don't normally feel with traditional schools, is once the students leave that school, they're done. You know, they don't really think about the school system. But I have a very, very, very solid place in my heart for community schools and for, well, mainly the New Mexico community schools. I mean, Albuquerque just was amazing. It literally gave me my life back. So I just wanted to make sure to say that to everybody, and I miss everybody. Not sure what else.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Monique. And I just also want to mention, it takes a lot of courage to share with a stranger, really, these very personal challenges. And so this is also kind of, community schools really help to build that relationship of trust between families and the school as an entity, right? I happen to be the coordinator, but really it could have been any coordinator. And so this is a really key component when we talk about the work of the pillars and how implementing those pillars happens in a school. And as Danette put in the chat, which is wonderful, and it's so true, that coordination happens everywhere, even at the zoo, on a field trip. And community schools, when we talk about active and authentic family engagement, are really about empowering parents and tapping into their skills and talents and passions, and then giving them leadership opportunities. And then, you know, who knows, ultimately they can become community school coordinators themselves and impact other parents, and it becomes a generational cycle of transformation. So we really appreciate you spending some time with us today, Monique, and sharing your story and inspiring all of us as community school personnel and leaders.
Thank you, Deanna.
I also wanted to add that because of community schools, I was able to make this trip home. And if you guys see, well, he's right here on my screen, but his name is James Mills. That is my dad. That's who I went home to.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you, Deanna, for that wonderful introduction, and really for grounding that work for today, you know, because it is about that collaboration. Before I introduce the next speaker, I wanted to add my own personal connection to community schools comes actually through the lens of my wife. She was an English language development teacher, and she worked very closely with her community school coordinator, because the population of students that she was teaching were refugee, immigrant, and newly arrived students here to Albuquerque who lacked those basic resources and had those very real needs. And the work that we're doing is all about transforming the lives of the students, the families, and that's all very real and part of this process. So thank you for sharing your very personal story with us this morning. As we transition into the plenary session, the topic is how do we equitably maximize collaborative leadership? This is being led by Andrea Quintana, the president of New Mexico ASCD. She's going to be working us through a very specific logic model, one that I have used. I actually used this very logic model in the launching of this summit. And so I have such value in this process. And so I just welcome to the stage, Andrea, and thank you for sharing your talents with us this morning.
Thank you all for having me today. We are going to be working through that same logic model that Greg shared with you all. And so hopefully you have that so that you can begin to really dive into it and make some application to your own school and the people that you work with. And so today we're going to be looking at collaborative leadership and practices and using that logic model to really help you start some planning. And so to get us started, again, my name is Andrea Quintana. I am a National Board Certified Teacher and the NMASCD President. And hopefully you can learn a little bit more about NMASCD and join in the work that we're doing to support teachers and educators around the state. So today our goal is to consider the question, what can we do today to begin planning effective collaborative leadership and practices that we can implement tomorrow? So using this logic model, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into, we're hopefully going to find some practices that we can start tomorrow, within the next week, within the next month, and then to really plan out into the next year, really building on that collaborative leadership, building in structures and people to really help that work start in your schools. So using the logic model that we're borrowing from Teach to Lead, which is a fabulous resource if you've ever been a part of their work, and kind of defining the logic model because it has impact. It really helps everybody on board to really understand what they're working towards and making those goals very clear. It helps with the communication because everybody understands what they're working towards and how. It really works with planning because it does sequence out intended effects and outcomes and help you start defining what exactly you're going to be working on. And it gives you that support that you need to determine who are the people working with you and who do you need to add to the work that you're going to be doing. So really using this logic model can really help define some of the things that maybe were not as clear as you'd like them to be. So today we're looking at collaborative leadership and practices. You dove into this yesterday, really thinking about parents, students, teachers, principals, community partners to build that culture of professional learning and trust at your school site. And I love the story that Monique shared because you do recognize that this isn't only about students. It's not even only about parents, but it's everybody working together to have those trust and those relationships to build those outcomes for both students and families. And so who do you need to be part of that collaborative leadership with you? And who's already there to help you start to build this in even a little bit further. So to get us started today, I'm just going to give you some time to reflect based on what I've just shared and what you worked on yesterday. What's going well with collaborative leadership at your school currently? And I encourage you to take some notes, jot things down if you would, and start to just really think about what's going well with collaborative leadership at your school currently, reflecting on all of the partners that are part of collaborative leadership, the students, the parents, the community. What's going well? What do you need for collaborative leadership to support? What are some of the goals that you have for your collaborative leadership team? Who's part of that team currently? And what structures do you have in place to support the goals that you're working in? And then how does your community currently support financial and resource development? And what more do you need? So I'm just going to give you a minute to start reflecting and think about your school, the people that are working within your leadership team, And who do you still need to invite to that table to have that voice and that impact for students and families? And so we're just going to take a few minutes here and just reflect. Again, I encourage you to jot down some notes because you'll need these notes as we continue through the logic model. We'll give 1 minute for just some thinking. Right. After a minute of reflection on our current state of leadership at our school, we hope to build off of the things that are going well. So keep that at the top of your mind. Keep that as your number one thing, because we do really want to build off of the things that are going well. That's going to kind of be the base of our framework today. This logic model, which was also shared by Greg yesterday, and I believe in your packet, starts with the problem of practice. And the idea that this problem of practice is going to be kind of that statement that identifies what is collaborative leadership and what is something that you're working to improve. What is something that you need? What is something that would benefit your school in a way that will impact students and families? So as you start to think of this problem of practice, you're going to work towards creating solutions as well. And so working through this logic model, first we identify what we're working towards. And you might want to do a reverse planning of this. You might want to start with some of the things that you hope to accomplish and work backwards to say, what is the thing that we now need? The second step for this will be to identify some of the causes. Identify and maybe discuss and brainstorm some of the reasons that things aren't happening to help us get to that end goal. And so these can be causes that you know or causes that you still need to determine. Working with your team today is really going to be impactful, and also working with your peers that are also working at other school sites can also help this as well, because they might be or have faced a similar problem and have some solutions to help you build. Then we will revisit that problem statement, redefine it a little bit, and create a final statement. This problem of practice can help guide the work of your year, possibly your month, or even just starting tomorrow with something that you can do to start working towards creating a more systematic approach to collaborative leadership at your school site. So think about what are those challenges that we're trying to solve. When we start to think about what would that ideal system look like in our schools. Following this, we will come up with some theory of action, as well as in future sessions today, think about some of those action steps that you can take. So we won't necessarily dive into that today with me, but I know that you'll have an opportunity to work on that later on today. So I want everyone to engage with me in a quick protocol called the magic wand. And I was a former kindergarten teacher for 20 years, and it's kind of in my blood to be kind of whimsical. And so I want you to envision holding that magic wand, and that magic wand is in your hand. And that magic wand is going to create a solution to all of the collaborative leadership problems at your school site. And maybe they're not problems, but maybe just we want it to be the best collaborative leadership. We know that this cooperation amongst stakeholders is going to really impact students. And with this magic wand, we're going to be able to give with one swoosh all of the solutions that we need, all of the ideas, and it's going to just work like magic, if you would. And so as we take this magic wand and wave it, what would the most ideal situation look like at your school site, with everybody working together in a systematic way, a machine that's been well oiled for years, everybody really honing in on student and family needs in your community, community partners working together with you in that, families and students knowing exactly what the school can offer them and it meeting their needs. What would that look like at your school site? I'm just going to give everybody a minute to whoosh your magic wand and think about what would that ideal, most perfect fit for your school and your community, what would that leadership look like? How often would you meet? How would that feel? How would that look to an insider as well as to an outsider? And just, I'm going to give you a minute. You can even close your eyes if you'd like to, and envision that fairy tale, if you would, that magic wand. So unlike Cinderella, as we wave this magic wand, at midnight, this illusion doesn't go away. What we want is to use some of that vision to really help us create what could be our first step and what could be our outcome, what could be our long-term goal to really make this collaborative leadership and system working at our school and within our community be that well-oiled machine that we're hoping for. And so as you envisioned that end goal, which is fabulous, everybody's needs are being met, everybody's working well with each other, let's start with our first step. So because we are not going into breakout rooms today for this session, we're just going to use a comment blend in the chat. And so if you would start to envision what that end goal would look like, what's the first thing you need? What could possibly be a problem of practice or something that you want to work towards to get to that first place? What's the first thing that you want to get some feedback from your peers and colleagues in this session today? So we're going to start with looking in the chat and thinking, if I had that vision of my ideal, perfect collaborative leadership impacting my students and families, what's missing? What's the one thing that I don't have in place right now, or the one thing that I would like to strengthen? What's something that I feel is maybe a roadblock or a barrier? And just go ahead and add that to the chat right now. I'll give you some time to think about it and then add it, those ideas to the chat once you have them in your head. So if you have your idea of one thing that you would like to strengthen, one barrier you would like to overcome, and maybe if you don't know something that you would like to overcome or to focus on, maybe you could share some of that vision of that ideal machine, that ideal collaborative leadership. What would that look like? I know I heard Monique speaking of it earlier today, where she didn't even recognize that she was part of the community until she took that first field trip. And so really helping families know that they're part of a community before they even recognize that they need that community. I think that would be one vision of what glorious collaborative leadership could look like. I see a couple answers and ideas coming into the chat, so thank you to those who have added something. These are great ideas coming in. If you don't quite have your idea, if you've already added your idea to the chat, let's take some time now and maybe respond to anybody that you see. You can do the little @ symbol and their name, and maybe give them something that's worked for you in the past, possible idea or solution, or even feedback. This is an opportunity to connect with people who might be working towards the same outcome that you are, have the same barrier, or possibly you have a solution to a problem that they might have. You see, again, lots of great ideas and some connections coming through in the chat. So you know that you have some partners even in each other to really help this collaborative leadership kind of take off at your school and to continue to build. I see some ideas that impact students, impact families, impact the community. And some of them are just logistical ideas that need to happen as a first step before you can reach out to build a larger team. Some things just need to happen small, which are great first steps as well. Thank you to everyone for adding those ideas into the chat, and go ahead and continue to add them as you find connections or ways that you can be a resource. I often feel as a teacher that the best resource I have is the teacher next door. And so as principals and leaders, that can also be very true, that the best resource that you can have is each other. And knowing that you're working towards collaborative leadership at multiple sites, and being really that resource to be able to help and connect with each other as you work through it. It's great to have a sounding board and somebody that you can fall back on. So I encourage those relationships to continue. And so please feel free to continue using the chat to make those connections and help each other to solve some common problems. As we start to, we're going to have some time to work on that logic model a little bit more. What is one thing that you can start with to really create that successful collaborative leadership, what is the very first thing? What is one thing? Sometimes when you look at the idea of how am I going to connect to so many things, it could look like a mountain, right? One of my friends always tells me the way you eat an elephant is one bite at a time, right? You don't eat the entire elephant. And so collaborative leadership might look that way to you as well. And so how do you do that? What is the first bite that you'll take, or the first thing that you can start with to start creating that collaborative leadership? As you start to think of your problem of practice, let's think of the one thing that you can possibly conquer today that can build into what you do over the next month or year. So you don't have to bite off the entire thing at once, but you can take small pieces and really work towards that end outcome. So my time here with you is actually almost up, and we do want to give you some working time. So again, I'm going to say, what is something that you can consider for today? The one thing, that first step. I saw some ideas in the chat of just small things that need to happen. I need to schedule monthly meetings. That's something that can happen today, right? Get that calendar out and start that planning. What's something that you can do this month to create a plan to begin to work with your team? And so using this logic model, what is something that you can do this month to really get everybody on the same page, to start working towards that end outcome? And then what is something that you will do this year? How will you set a timeline for each month that you could check in on that goal and make sure you're progressing towards that ideal magic wand moment in your collaborative leadership? So as you start to eat that elephant, right, that big picture that you want to come, what are the small steps that you can take to get there? Definitely does not have to be all at once. So we are going to give you the last 15 minutes of this session to work in small groups with your collaborative partner that came with you today, or possibly by yourself, to start to fill in that logic model and start with some of those root causes, thinking about how you're going to get to that problem of practice goal as your outcome. And if you ever have any questions or things that I can do to support you, here are my contacts. I'm happy to help in any way. Again, I am with ASCD New Mexico, and we are structured around supporting teachers and educators in the state to really help in any way we can. So please feel free to reach out if there's ever anything I can do to help. Greg is also sharing with you that file once again in the chat, so that if you want to start completing that logic model, please do that. And I will send you off to breakout rooms to have some collaborative time to start thinking how to use this logic model to really start diving in to creating some steps. So again, thank you for having me, and have a wonderful day of learning.
Thank you, Andrea. We are going to be sending you to the breakout rooms. We're working on that right now. We did have a few individuals that we were trying to figure out what school that you were attached to. So as we send you out, if you don't end up in a room immediately, just let us know where you need to go. And there are some groups that we know that you were unaffiliated, so we're going to do our best to kind of pair you up and maybe be more of a peer partner rather than necessarily that shared leadership partner, but still collaboration is one of the keys to success in today's summit. Welcome back, everybody, to the larger session. I hope that you were all able to gain valuable perspectives working collaboratively with each other. I was able to join several sessions and just heard the really awesome discussions about beginning that process, both in schools and also as collaborative peer partners. One of our hopes throughout the summit is that those connections that we are creating in this summit will remain and be lasting thought partners, maybe as schools are able to share ideas. And also we hope that to strengthen the connection between the community school coordinator and the principal, and really just enable and transform that relationship. We're going to be transitioning into our second session. It is led by Dr. Gonzalez, the president of AJG Consulting, and also Danette Townsend, the executive director of ABC Community School Partnership. And so one of the wonderful things about this summit is that many of our presenters have collaborated together across different organizations to put on this summit. So thank you, Angela, and thank you, Danette. I'll turn this over to you.
Great, thank you, everyone. We're super excited to give this presentation today, and we're gonna start with some introductions, and then we'll jump right into our presentation. As Greg said, my name is Angelo Gonzalez. I run a consulting company in Albuquerque called AJG Consulting. But I've got a lot of experience working with community schools over the years, having served on the board of ABC Community School Partnership, as well as working at United Way of Central New Mexico on an initiative called Mission Graduate. And so super excited to talk to you today about whole school strategic planning, and want to turn it over to Danette to introduce herself.
Thank you, Angelo, and welcome everyone. As mentioned, my name is Danette Townsend. I'm the executive director of the ABC Community School Partnership. I've been working within community schools, starting as a coordinator since 2007. So I have been doing this work a long time, and those that know me know that the strategic planning part is my jam, and we're really excited to share some of these processes with you.
Excellent. So let's get started. We've got a wild ride today. We're going to be talking a lot today. So let me start by saying 40 minutes is not nearly enough for all that we want to share with you. And so this is mostly a one-way presentation, but we do want to encourage comments and questions in the chat box. And the two of us will be monitoring the chat, and we'll be responding or elevating questions. So please feel free to use the chat box as a tool of engagement. And depending on how things go with timing today, we might have a little bit of time for interaction, but just want to kind of warn everyone that we have a lot to go through. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's start with our workshop overview. Purpose of today's workshop is to provide an overview of strategic planning fundamentals. So we want to make sure everyone has a clear understanding of what strategic planning is and what some of the key concepts of strategic planning are. And then to make sure that that you all walk away with some tips and tools that you can use with your own school communities to conduct what we are calling a whole school strategic planning process. So three-part agenda today. We're going to talk a little bit about setting the stage and why strategic planning is important. Then we're going to give you an introduction to strategic planning, talk about an overview of the process of planning and how you can set expectations. We're going to talk a little bit about something we call current state analysis. Danette's going to go into some detail on that. And then really have a deep dive around what we call strategic direction setting, which is when you chart your course for the future. And then we'll end with some discussion about what happens after you create your strategic plan, which we call strategic action. How do you get organized to make sure that your strategic plan for your community school becomes a living document and a guide to the work that you're going to be doing in the years to come? And that really is kind of the segue to the presentation that our colleague Jared is going to do immediately following ours, where he's going to go much deeper into continuous improvement processes and how you take the results of your plan and start to embed them very, very deeply into the work of your community school. So let's talk a little bit about why you might want to do strategic planning in your community school. So first of all, it's critically important to do strategic planning to ensure that you are moving forward as one united school community toward a single vision of shared success. And what we mean by that is that often there are a lot of different things going on in your community schools. You may have your 90-day teams, you may have attendance improvement teams, you may have a health and wellness team, and you may have created visions and goals in all of those different teams over the course of the past several years or decades. And so the opportunity here is to think about how do you use your community school work as an opportunity to bring all of that together and to say, how are we really doing everything have a single vision as one united school community that achieves all of our collective goals. Danette?
Another step is really looking at how you truly understand your current state, the needs that need to be addressed, and the assets within the community school and the school community. And this is a critical piece. Having a very intentional strategy to addressing this and looking at it will really help you with your overall initiative.
So then once you have an understanding of your current state, then strategic planning can help you clarify your community school's desired future state, right? So given where you are now, where do you want to be at some point in the future? And that's where you build your shared vision, potentially update the mission for your school, and create the long-term goals that are going to be your guide for the future. And additionally, the strategic planning gives you the opportunity to really identify and prioritize your shorter term strategies, as well as the measurable objectives you're going to create to help you assess whether you're on track or off track toward achieving your long-term goals. I think this one's yours, Danette.
So Angela mentioned in the first bullet, one united school community. The strategic planning process will help you align and integrate all of the new programs you might be considering, the existing programs, initiatives, and structures toward one single direction and a unified mission. This is critically important in this strategy so that we're not just layering silo after silo, but we're all moving in a direction together to achieve one common vision.
And then lastly, as I said earlier, right, strategic planning lays a foundation. It's the beginning of your long-term work, and it lays a foundation for you to really go deep around continuous improvement and long-term change efforts within your community school. On that last point, we're not going to say a whole lot about that, but I encourage you to really make sure you are here for Jared's conversation immediately following ours, because he has some really rich content about how you can take a strategic plan and use it for good continuous improvement purposes. All right, well, let's start with an intro to strategic planning. And I want to start with an overview of what a good planning process looks like. And I'm going to point you to a resource that I use in my work that I have found to be extraordinarily helpful and is very, very adaptable for any sort of organizational context, including schools. So the book is called The Executive Guide to Facilitating Strategy. It's by Michael Wilkinson. I did get some training from him in a leadership program, and so I have some experience using his techniques. And I really, really like his approach because he simplifies it to kind of 3 big steps in your strategic planning process. It starts with strategic direction setting, which is answering the questions, where are we now and where do we want to be, right? Current state and future state. Second big step is what he calls implementation planning, but we are going to call priority setting in this presentation. And that simply answers the question, how will we get there, right? What are we going to do and how are we going to get there as a school community? And then the third step is where you go deep into your action planning. And the questions that you answer at this stage are getting into the nitty-gritty of what specifically are we going to do, what role are all of the different role groups within our community school going to play, who's responsible for different pieces of the plan, and then how are we going to monitor and ensure that we are making progress toward the goals that we've established. 3 big steps. So the outputs then of this 3-step process are on the screen. It starts with the development of a vision and a mission statement. We're going to go into depth on all of these outputs in the next slides. Then once you have a vision and mission, it's also about creating goals. The vision, mission, and goals collectively are your strategic direction for the future. Then it's about setting priorities, and that involves creating objectives, identifying critical success factors, which pave the way for you to be successful, identifying barriers, and then building your strategies, right? Which are your kind of like your big buckets of work, the big areas where you really want to invest a lot of time and resources that you think are going to help propel you toward achieving your goals. I've also added the terms assets and needs in here, right? Because as community schools, you are being asked to conduct needs assessments and asset maps as part of your, if you're getting a community school grant from the state. And I just want to say, like, an asset is really closely related to a critical success factor. Assets are those people and resources and other things that you draw upon from within your community, your school community, to support your work and help lay a foundation for success. And then needs are often the barriers that can stand in the way of helping you achieve your long-term goals. On the action planning side, the output here is actually an action plan. And what you're really aiming for is every time, for all the strategies you build, you would have one action plan per strategy. And so I'm going to come back to this diagram throughout the presentation, but I want to just give you a broad orientation to what actually gets produced in a strategic planning process. I also like to visualize this with a really crazy visual that I created for a community school that Danette and I worked with last year to do this process. And it's a little bit goofy, but bear with me. What you're really doing is you're starting with your current state and you're identifying where you are now. You are articulating a vision and goals. You're aiming for the moon, right? You're saying, where do we want to be? What do we want to accomplish? And that's typically over like a 3 to 5 year period. I tend to like 5-year strategic plans, but for a school, you may want to have a shorter time horizon. You know, like a middle school, since you've got 3 grade levels, you might want to have a 3-year strategic plan. For a high school, it may be a 4 or 5-year strategic plan. So as you articulate where you want to be, you're aiming for the moon, then you're thinking about, you know, how do we start to get from the earth to the moon? And the mountains aren't going to get you all the way there, but the mountains, I think, are a good metaphor for this work. Has its ups and downs. It's challenging, right? You're going to be, sometimes you're going to be really climbing some steep mountains to be able to achieve shorter term objectives. But the key here is that you are systematically moving toward achieving those long-term goals and that big vision that you've set for yourself. That's what objectives are, right? They're the kind of intermediate goals that you're setting that are moving you toward your long goals. Problem is that there are often barriers that stand in the way. And so articulating those barriers is really important so that you can create strategies to be able to break through those barriers. And the strategies that you articulate are what really propel you forward, right? Your strategies are your biggest bets around how you're going to be able to achieve your long-term goals over a period of time. And so again, I told you this is a crazy visual, but sometimes people are very visual and like they remember the mountains rather than the planning process outputs. Last thing on this slide is that every mountain that you climb should have an action plan, right? What's your game plan for how you're going to scale that mountain? And that's really where you get into the real nitty-gritty of the work and start to articulate who's responsible for what are we going to do, and on what time frame. Annette?
Thank you. So who should participate in this, right? We all know that the more people we have sitting at the table, the more complex anything becomes. But in this process, it is critical that you have as broad and diverse of engagement as you possibly can. So reminding everyone that the site-based leadership team, the community school site-based leadership team, manages this process. They also provide the bridging between the school community and the community stakeholders as you are building this integrated approach. And that also ensures that broad and diverse engagement I just mentioned. So we kind of look at this in phases and then sort of a loose timeline. Every community school is different. It's unique to that school community, but this is a rough outline. We have the first 2 to 3 months. The first thing you're looking at is that current state analysis or that deep community assessment. Who leads that work? The community school coordinator is the leader of this work. They engage and gain support of folks like the principal, the administrative team, the site-based leadership team, if it already exists, and this is a revisit to an assessment, the school staff, community partners, etc., trusted messengers, which I'll get into later in our presentation. Then they move into that strategic direction setting that Angelo mentioned. You know, we start at current analysis. Where are we? The direction setting is looking at where do we want to be, and then we work at our priorities. The same group is doing both of these parts, but the principal and the coordinator start to become a partnership, and they work together to lead that direction setting because the principal also holds the academic understanding of where we need the whole school to be in that realm. But that may not be the only priority for the broader community. Then we move into the next 3 months that focus on the priority setting. The principal and the coordinator still leading the work. Then we developed more of a planning team. We're starting to pare down this really broad voice into more of a working team that still includes similar stakeholders, but the players may look a little bit different. They may be more focused on people who are connected directly to something within that school rather than an overall organization. Then we look at the other thing that in that piece to be really conscious of is this is where student voice, either directly or indirectly, really starts to come into the conversation and should never be left out. So if you're middle school, high school, kids at the table, students at the table. If you're in elementary school, you play it by ear, but having someone who also represents and works really closely with your students to be able to bring their voice to the table. Then it moves into the action planning phase. The community school coordinator is the leader of this phase. Excuse me. And that planning team is the same folks as above, most likely, but also really intentionally looking at who are we missing? Who is directly delivering work on the ground with our students, families, and community that maybe isn't sitting here at this stage? Because they are the ones that are most likely they're going to carry out the actions you're deciding on. And once you have that planning phase in place, you now have a map of where you need to go and what you need to do. Then the site-based leadership team really kicks in. This site-based leadership team started as a core, broad group of stakeholders. Now we're probably narrowing it down, creating a more robust picture of who should be there. Those folks are now responsible for the ongoing communication, alignment, and monitoring of that action plan. And again, the coordinator is leading this. When we earlier in the day had some comments around, maybe I made a comment that coordinators don't always coordinate in the office because they're working to lead these processes with larger groups of people. And that work can be sort of ambiguous, right? Like they're moving people through this.
Sorry, what was that? You cut out there. Going back there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I was just putting it back to you. So we'll get more into some details in a few.
Okay, excellent. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of setting expectations. So as a principal and coordinator team, right, are working closely together is the first expectation. It's really essential, right, that the two of you, the principal and the coordinator, are working hand in hand, that you're united in driving this process. Because that's really going to set you up for success, and it's going to ensure that this plan becomes a living guide for action for years to come in your community schools.
So the second expectation is always having very well-defined meeting objectives. And equally as important is taking into account the diverse composition of the groups you're engaging in this process. You want to make sure that people are ready, and as you're looking at your objectives, how do we make sure that those who maybe typically don't have a seat at the table, haven't had a path to get to that table, or haven't had a voice, an active voice while sitting at that table, also feel confident, they feel like they understand the language we're using, and they feel as though they truly are an actionable decision maker in the process. If we don't have well-defined objectives, people that are not working in the school tend to fall off because they don't know where they're fitting in and how they're contributing to the success.
The sequence of the sequence of conversations, right, around your strategic planning process also matters. And what I mean by that is, as Danette laid out in the previous slide, starting with current state analysis is necessary before you can get to strategic direction, which is necessary before you can get to the conversations around priorities. And so be careful about jumping around in this process, because there is a well-defined sequence that will ultimately get you to the end result. And also we want to add that there are going to be times when you probably need to have conversations outside of your formal process. And this is to Danette's point about people maybe who aren't, who don't know the terminology and are entering into it for the first time. There may be a need to invest some time in preparatory conversations, right? Making sure people are really ready for the experience that you're creating for them as you're building your formal strategic plan.
And the next is really try to avoid the temptation of going straight to solutions. So our human nature is to solve the problem right now. We're busy, our plates are full, we need to just get to it. Instead, allow and plan for intentional time and space for collective dreaming before jumping to action. If we dream together, the solutions we come up with are no longer in our own personal silos, but we're using our own experience to help inform how we get to that dream.
So let's talk about collective dreaming. This is the term I really like to use for strategic direction setting. And so we'll say a little bit more about how you create a vision, mission, and goals in this presentation. But what I always want you to think about here, strategic direction is jargon, right? And I come back to it because it means something to me. But I think that the terminology that I think really resonates with people is this idea of like articulating a dream for what you want for your community school, and then doing that with the group and really think about what is our collective dream that we can imagine together, right? Where we want to be at some point in the future. That is what strategic direction is all about. And the reason this is important, creating a collective dream about your future, is because it really helps you get unstuck when you get into the hard work. It becomes like your guiding star, right? When you really get into a space where like maybe there's disagreement around how you should move forward, the place that always kind of helps you get unstuck is reminding people about what your vision is that you've come up with together and where you want to be in the future. And usually there's broad agreement on that, and that can help people find a way forward through the hard decisions that you might have to make around how you get there.
Another critical expectation here is the plan itself, the homework that you did, the stuff you wrote down is not nearly as important as ensuring that your school community's understanding of the plan and the commitment to the plan are intact. We are building a foundation for collective action. And with transitions in education, which we all know happen pretty rapidly and often, we need as many people committed to moving this forward as possible so that no matter what happens, we don't lose sight. Not to say the plan isn't important, because that's still that guide, but the commitment and the understanding that we are all in this together is what is going to sustain this effort over time.
And then our last point here is we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of the tools of strategic planning that I use in my work, that Danette uses in ABC. But we want to impress upon you that there are lots of different tools and methodologies out there for conducting strategic planning. You may have a preferred process or set of tools that you use, and that's okay, right? What we really just want to impress upon you today is that whatever process you commit to, you want to make sure that it's a good process that helps you come out of it knowing what direction you're headed, who's helping you drive, how you're going to get there, and how you'll know when you've arrived, right? So we're not trying to push a particular process on you today. We want to kind of walk you through the broad outlines of what a good process looks like. And ultimately, you choose a process that works for you and your school communities, but make sure that it results in these particular outcomes. So let's jump into it. We're going to turn it back over to Danette, who's going to talk about analyzing the current state, and in particular, the idea of creating a comprehensive community assessment.
Thank you. So again, the keys here are intentionality, equity, and representation. So the best way, we know the best way to get to where we're going is to start from where we are, right? So we're going to look at this from a current state. This is a quote from the CDC, and I think the takeaway from this is not about us without us. That when we engage people deeply in the planning, the organizing, the process, we also engage people deeply in the implementation, the design and implementation and success. Go ahead. So one of the most important things when you're bringing broad stakeholders together is to have a common mental model and understanding of terms. The term need can often be seen from a deficit lens. And I think when we are talking about it here, what we are talking about is it referring to the gap between the current state, what is, and the future state, the desired state, where do we want to be? And what happens in between is what gets us there. And that's the need we're talking about in community schools. And the assessment piece of it is really the systematic approach that helps guide us to action to improve our programming, to improve our services, to shift and improve our organizational structures or operations of a community school. Go ahead. So the first thing you're going to want to do is to really assemble a core group that will be the foundation of your site-based leadership team. In Albuquerque, we call it a community school council, and this is just a guide that we use. It's 13 different sectors that tend to be representative in most of our communities. Yours may look a little different, but what's important about this is to identify those sectors in your community that really have a stake in community success. It's a lot, right? It's a lot of people. But the piece of the site-based leadership team to keep in mind is that at the state level, we have a statute. That statute clearly defines what this group looks like, and it is diverse. It has representation of parents, teachers, staff, union, community members, trusted messengers, local businesses, all of those things, right? What we also want to make sure of is not only are the sectors represented, but are the people representing those sectors representative of your school community? So you may have business leaders on your team, but do those business leaders have the diversity makeup that reflects who you are serving in your school community? Go ahead. So the first thing, I mentioned intentionality. Everything in a community school is about intention. So the first thing you want to do is sort of outline, what is our data collection going to look like? Who is it that we want to, who do we want to connect with? What are the methods we want to use? What are the people, the questions, the outreach? And really looking at this in a very systematic way. Go ahead. The next step is going back to those sectors. This is where the core group that you have will really start to identify who those sectors are that you want to engage. But then also, is there any existing data that we can just gather quickly and sort of review? And what is it that we want to look at? What components are there? If we're looking, let's say, at a sector of business leaders, what is it you want to know? Is it about workforce development? Is it about jobs available? Is it about challenges businesses are having within your school community? Those are the types of things you process within this smaller group to then start reaching out. Go ahead.
Is that the right one?
Yes. The next is really looking at your methods. When you get the copy of this presentation, that link that says possible data collection methods in community schools will be live. That will take you to a very brief spreadsheet that just gives some ideas around how you might want to collect the data you're looking for. A survey isn't enough when it comes to community school planning. And you also want to identify, is the best method for something you're trying to achieve a focus group? Is it a survey? Is it observation? Those are the various things you can do. And so the spreadsheet will have advantages, disadvantages, what they are, to give you sort of a jumping point, a starting point to look at what you want to obtain information around and how you want to do it. And ideally, looking at maybe 2 different methods per sector will give you both quantitative and qualitative information so you have a full picture. Next is looking at, I mentioned the trusted messengers. Collecting data is about trust. People need to trust that you're going to be authentically listening to what they have to say and that you're going to act upon it. So finding the folks in your communities and your schools that are trusted messengers for the sectors that you're trying to engage is really critical, because bad data leads to bad decisions. So you want to make sure that you have really solid data and that it's really informing the work that you're doing and the plan that you're creating moving forward. And those folks, the trusted messengers, are the people that can help you connect in that way. Then you gotta look at developing your questions. What is it we want to ask, and what do we want to learn about the strengths and the opportunities of specific community components within each sector? You might be looking, it might be one question you just want to answer. How do we engage business communities? How do we engage parents better? But this is where your core group, which hopefully is growing and getting more and more diverse as you all are having conversations about who is not at the table, will create the questions you want to know. Having this be very intentional and organized will also help it run more smoothly. Then we're going to revisit our trusted messengers again, right? Then we're going to create an outreach plan. Who are the key members within this sectors, the trusted messengers, that are going to help us engage this sector and in our research, if you will. Members of the community school council or site-based leadership team, who will be conducting this together, which small teams. Remember that this work is never just a coordinator, principal, school staff effort. It's never just a community effort. It is getting as many people to help lift that tide as you can. And go ahead to I think is that the last one, Angela? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't have my, oh, there we go. So again, this is high level. There are many more details to a really good comprehensive plan, but you get the idea around the intentionality and the steps that you take to move it forward.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Danette. And so again, now we're moving into, you've got your needs assessment, your community assessment done. You have now a really, really deep data-informed understanding of your current state. And now we're turning our conversation with the people you've assembled to an articulation of where we want to be at some point in the future, 3 to 5 years out. And so again, we call this strategic direction setting, and I want to begin with a grounding and some definitions. And so the first key definition is the idea of vision. Vision is a picture. It's a picture of that desired future state that your community school is working to bring about. Your mission then is all of those things that you do as an organization, as a school, every day, over and over, to achieve your vision, right? It's what it's what you do. Then the goals are what we call broad long-term aims that define the fulfillment of your mission. And then they also represent different elements of your vision that you've managed to achieve. So the key point here, again, we're going to continue to reinforce this throughout, which is that it is super vitally important that you engage a broad and diverse group of stakeholders to develop your community school's strategic direction. The more broad and diverse it is, the better your vision and mission and goal statements are going to be. So let me give you, we're going to share a technique that we've used. And I've used this a lot with clients of mine in strategic planning that is really adaptable for lots of contexts. And it's a collective dreaming. It's a visualization activity. And the way it works is it starts with the scenario. So typically you have someone who is leading this visualization process, and usually it's a good storyteller who can outline a picture of some event that's happening in the future. So imagine that it's 5 years from now, July 2026, and your community school is receiving an award from the president for being one of the top schools in the nation. However, that's defined. So you've been invited to attend, your team, your principal coordinator team, and you've also brought along members of your site-based leadership team to accept the award, right? So you're picturing yourself in the audience, and it's this like amazing event, right? Where the president is going to be giving you a big award. So during this event, there are lots of speeches, right? People are getting up and saying how great your community school is and everything that you've managed to achieve. So your job then, this is you sitting in the audience, is to think about what the president, members of your school community that are present are saying about why your community school was selected for this honor. Some of the things you might be listening for, right, are what your school accomplished. What are the great things that individual role groups are saying about your community school? Maybe it's what students are saying, or what families are saying, school staff, partners, other stakeholders. Maybe folks are talking very specifically about things you did, right, that really made a difference and contributed to this great success. And then, thinking about the people who work in the school or the partners who are engaged with your school, what's the experience like for them now in this new reality that you've brought about? So then what you do in this activity, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes to practice this. We don't have a lot of time. But you ask people, you invite people to individually start to write down, to begin to develop a picture in their mind about this future state that people are describing, and then to start to jot down specific elements of that future state that you see in your head, right, that you feel, that you experience. And again, this is basically answering the question, what are your own hopes and dreams for your community school that have finally come to pass? that are getting celebrated at this really amazing big event with the President of the United States. And so I want to actually, we're going to, typically the last step in this process, let me close this out, is then you would invite people to share out what they saw, what they wrote down. And then I'll share a little bit about what that exercise looks like and how you bring it all together. I'm going to give you no more than 2 minutes, and I want to see in the chat box, what are your hopes and dreams for your community schools, right? When you think 5 years out, let's say your community school was invited to get celebrated by the president, right? What would you hope the story is that's being told about your success as a community school? What are the elements of that future state? Again, we're really low on time, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do this. And then I want to just see some cool ideas in the chat box of what you come up with. Don't overthink this. You're getting celebrated by the president. What's he saying about you? Maybe 5 years from now, what's she saying about you? Not seeing anything in the chat yet. Excellent. Thank you, Trish. A place of community and family engagement. Students and families feel comfortable and welcome. It's a great articulation of a future state. What else? Monica, I live across the street from Kit Carson. Our community has an amazing culture. I'd like Kit Carson to feel that same culture. I love it. Sylvia, here's a school that,
oh, sorry.
I'll give you the next one to that. So here's a school that truly puts families first. They are the true meaning of it takes a village. That's beautiful. I'd like to hear a few more. Go for it, Danette.
Open the connections between the school and the community and the greater community as a whole. Fernando, thank you. I think we also had one from Allison, full-time pantry and primary dental and primary care services.
Excellent. Let's see 1 or 2 more and then we're going to move forward. Diana, tools and opportunities for families to be successful and grow through community resources. Excellent. All right, so you all get the idea. I'd love to see some more. Let's populate, just put it in the chat box because these are really cool vision statements, right? For what kind of a collective dreaming for community schools broadly in our state, what we want to see for community schools. Basically what you do with this, right? This is the kind of activity that you would do with your school community. And you would probably be doing this either in person or online. And we like Post-it notes. So if you're in person, Post-it notes are the best, sticky notes. Everyone, like you just did, you each wrote down an individual vision element. That would be something you'd put on a Post-it note. And what we would start to do is populate a wall with all of your individual dreams for the future on Post-it notes. And if you're doing this online, Google Jamboard could be a really cool resource. So we've given you an example of what that could look like on the screen. Or if you have another online tool that you use, feel free to use that instead. But this is what it all looks like at the end of the day. Danette gave me permission to share the strategic planning brainstorm that we did with ABC Community School Partnership at a system level. Lots and lots of Post-it notes. It gets really messy. And what you end up doing in this process is creating themes from the Post-it notes. And you can see in this case, we created themes around holistic approach to children, equity and inclusion, data, holistic approach to families, and so on. And the reason this is important is because these ideas and these themes now become the starting point for the creation of your goals and your vision. So your goals then really are they're the broad long-term aims that help you define whether you've achieved your mission. They usually start with a verb, and I've given you some examples of what those verbs look like. They generally speak to your aspirations. So goals, the way we define them here, they're not always measurable. They're more aspirational than measurable. Objectives, on the other hand, are in fact measurable. And importantly, the themes that you created in your visualization activity become the starting point to create your goal statements. And we put goals first because I've found now doing this a number of times that actually starting with the creation of goals is really helpful, even putting it before creating a mission and vision. So here's some examples of what goal statements could look like. So let's say you had a theme around youth voice, and you had a lot of really good ideas about what it means to lift up young people's voices. Well, you could have a goal that says, we're going to deliver high quality, impactful educational experiences that are informed by youth voice. You might have a career readiness goal that says, we're going to foster the development of students' understanding of different career opportunities and exposure to careers that are aligned with their interests. You might have a theme of family engagement with the goal that says that you're going to ensure that all families feel welcome and supported by school staff. And maybe you have a goal about cultural and linguistic responsiveness, right? To instill a sense of belonging among students and families in our community school. So basically what you're doing is you're taking all of the good ideas from the visualization activity and you're rolling them up into some larger themes, and then you're creating concise goal statements about where you want to be at some point in the future. The second thing you do with the visualization activity is you create a vision statement. So again, you're using all of the individual elements from your visualization to create that statement. And what your aim is to create a picture of the future state that you want to achieve. There are two types of visions. You can have either an impact-focused one or an organization or school-focused vision. And importantly, you want to avoid putting elements of your mission into your vision. So the vision describes the future state. It doesn't describe what you do. That's the key distinction here. I've given you some examples on this slide of what a good vision statement could look like. So an impact-focused one is going to focus more on the outcomes for students and families, right? So maybe an impact-focused vision is that all students are deeply engaged in their learning in school and out of school, and actively collaborate with their families, school staff, and partners to achieve academic success, good health, and social emotional well-being. A school-focused or organization-focused one would say something about the change you're bringing about within your school. In this case, maybe it's something like students, families, staff, and partners share power and continually work to dismantle systems and structures that perpetuate racism and oppression, both within school and in the community at large. And then you can mix it up, right? You can have elements of both an impact focus and a student or an organization focus, and you can read the example on the screen of what that looks like. So a mission statement then, and we're running a little low on time, so I'm going to speed up a little. A mission statement defines the purpose of your community school, and a mission always answers three questions. What do we do? For whom do we do it? And what's the benefit? A mission describes the work that you're doing over and over to achieve your vision. And I want to just make the point here that a mission may seem fairly prescribed if you're working in a school, right? You educate students. That's kind of like the basic traditional mission of a school. But there's actually a lot of power engaging your school community in a conversation about those three mission questions, because it really helps everyone understand that community schools are not just doing business as usual, right? That there's a lot more that a community school does than just the education of children. And it's also a great opportunity to create buy-in for your mission by engaging people in the discussion. So I'm a Harry Potter fan. So here's a couple of examples of mission statements. So let's say Gryffindor Community School partners with families and community organizations to ensure that students' holistic academic health and social emotional needs are met, and provides rigorous experiential learning opportunities to ensure that all students are well prepared for high school. The bolded items really speak directly to what you do as a community school. And then you can see another example on the screen that takes a kind of different approach. So in this community school, they facilitate power sharing and the development of strong relationships to ensure that students have opportunities to learn in the classroom, at home, and in their communities 24/7, 365. So lots of approaches you could take to creating a mission that go beyond the traditional approach. Okay, we're gonna zoom through this. So let's talk about priority setting. So the elements of priority setting include objectives, which are your specific, quantifiable, and realistic targets that measure whether or not you've achieved the goal. Critical success factors are the conditions that you need to create to achieve your objectives. Barriers are the challenges that hinder achievement of one or more objectives. And your strategies then are the broad activities that are required to achieve an objective, to create one of those critical conditions for success, or to overcome some big barrier that's standing in the way. They always begin, if you design them well, with a verb, and they have this kind of structure of verb, object, purpose. And I'm going to give you some examples in just a minute. So how do you develop strategies? Again, it's a brainstorm. And I've found that this is actually fairly easy to do because people inherently want to jump to solutions. And that's what a strategy is, right? It's a solution. So you give people time to reflect individually, and you're connecting this to the goal statements you develop. You're asking people to write down as many strategies as they can think of to achieve the goals that you've identified. And then you have 3 sources to draw from. You can actually pull from your community assessment, any objectives you've created, or critical success factors and barriers that you've identified in your conversations. We're not going to do this activity because we're out of time. So instead, I've given you some examples of what strategy statements look like. And I'll walk through just a couple of them so that we can move through this section. But let's take that youth voice goal as a good example, starting point, right? So the goal was to deliver high quality, impactful educational experiences informed by youth voice. One strategy to achieve that might be that you create a youth advisory council as part of your site-based leadership team to provide regular and meaningful input into the design and improvement of programs and activities. There's a number of them in family engagement, right? But your goal was to ensure that families feel welcome and supported by school staff. One strategy might be to train teachers, administrators, and all school staff in family engagement best practices. Keep in mind, just take a look at the structure of all of these statements. They all begin with a verb. They have some object that follows the verb. And then they have a short articulation of the purpose of the strategy. Objectives then are how you take your goals and you start to create short-term measurable objectives that tell you whether you're on track or not. I'm not going to go through these. I'm going to leave these in the document so that when you have a chance to review this later on, you can kind of get a sense of what an objective statement looks like. But this gives you a way to measure, right, whether you're on track toward achieving your longer-term goals or not. Last thing here is you're going to end up with about a gazillion potential strategies because that's what brainstorming always produces. And so you always want to have some step in your process where you are prioritizing your strategies. And I'm going to leave this tool in here and not talk about it today because Jared in his presentation actually has a full treatment on prioritization. But essentially what it boils down to is you can either have people vote on what their top priorities are, and that's where you have people with sticky dots and they go and they vote, literally go put a dot on the strategies they think are the highest priorities. Or you can create a more formal prioritization that has to do with how resource intensive is a strategy to enact, and then what's the potential for impact of a given strategy. And again, Jared's going to say a lot more about this in his presentation. And then to close us out, action planning, you can't forget about it. Once you have your strategies, you got to leave time to get into the real nitty gritty, to pull small teams together, to start to identify what's the actual detailed work you're going to undertake to carry out your strategies. And there's a lot of elements, but I'm going to leave you a template that you might be able to take and adapt for your work that identifies roles and responsibilities for each of the different strategies and allows you to start to sequence your work and create deadlines to make sure that you stay on track. Action planning is critically important, and it's one of the key things that helps you ensure that this becomes a living document. It's also important that you communicate your work. When you create your plan, you've got to communicate your change vision out. You got to have steps in here where you're bringing people along and helping them understand what it is you're trying to do so that you can ensure better coordination of activities, build trust with your community, and really create a more inclusive school community with roles and responsibilities for all stakeholders. And I'm going to skip through these slides and leave these in, but I think my parting comments are going to be how you start to align your work toward your existing structures. We've already said a lot about that. And there's having intentionality around connecting the dots to other initiatives in your schools is a super important part of making your plan a living document. And then getting set up to monitor and ensure that you are on track toward achieving your goals is another big part, and having structures in place and regular intervals by which you're looking at data and having conversations, right, around whether or not you need to make adjustments to your plan. So I apologize we went over, but there's a lot of content in here. Our contact info is on the screen. And so with that, we are at the end. Anything else, Greg?
Thank you, Angelo and Danette, for that incredible presentation. Angelo, I always learn so much about strategic planning from you, and Danette, just thank you for helping guide us through that process. We definitely need a break, and so what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the schedule briefly, slightly. Let's break until 10:55, and then when we come back, we'll be introducing the next presenter. So see you guys in 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, it's really exciting to hear what's happening in New Mexico and just see the interactions and the discussions that are happening here. I come to you from Denver, but also have been doing some work with some individuals within New Mexico, within the NEA, and then at some of the school sites where I've been coaching some individuals, but also have been working and thinking about community schools at the national level, and how do we create systems of continuous improvement for just like basically how we do our operations as community schools. So I think I'm gonna have Deanna share her screen, because my internet has been a little bit on the fritz. So we'll see what happens here if we can get that up. But I'm gonna ask you to put a few things in the chat as we go. I'm gonna be doing a lot of talking. I'm gonna ask you to interact through the chat, but then also we'll have some time to break out and kind of connect some of this that I'm sharing, what Angelo shared, and what was shared this morning around the logic model all together. Yep, great. So you can go on to the next slide. So Angelo and Danette shared a lot about the planning process. And to have any successful community school, you'll need that process of putting all of that together, having the consistent plan, understanding the vision, the mission, and all of that. But then also, there are some other considerations. Once we have our plan, we actually have to do something with it. And many times we jump to the solutions to just move really fast, get things going. And fast is good, as long as we're learning along the way. And some of the considerations to take that you can begin to think about are, how will you manage this change? What actual processes do you have in place to manage the change overall? Who is responsible? So not only for the entire initiative, but who's responsible for the different pieces? And then also, how will you know that the change is successful? So if you're doing changes, if you're making changes, how do you know that each one of those individual pieces is working? And then also, there's always challenges with implementation. Whatever we design, we always learn about it a little more by doing it. And how do we then manage or overcome implementation challenges as we're going through the process of doing the work? And so those are just some of the considerations, pretty big, complex considerations to think about. But as I kind of read through, as you were putting in what you would want the president to say about your school, I saw some really huge things coming out. And a few of those things were, that you are the place where, families are truly connecting to the school, where you're providing resources and supports to everyone. So it's not just segmented, it's really everyone. So at the basic sense, though, community schools are extremely complex organizations. They're not just working with things within your control, but you're really working with all sorts of other entities or problems that are possibly outside of your school walls, but you're inviting into that space. And you're inviting in a way that only a school can do, as a safe place for all of those things to intersect. So this is extremely complex work. And in order to do that complex work, we need some sort of frameworks to think about the work. And so what I'm going to introduce you to today is a continuous improvement framework called the Model for Improvement. It's actually one of the more simple things from its basic context, but it also gives you some of those tools and processes to be able to take what you've put in place from the planning to an actual implementation and actions, and also learn from the work that you do. So there are three pieces around this model for improvement. You can go to the next slide. And Angela talked a little bit about the goals, the measures, and strategies. And actually, I wanted to show how they align here. So there are three questions that the model for improvement really forces us to ask. And it's, what are we trying to accomplish? So really, what is our goal? What are we trying to accomplish? And if you're ever sitting in a meeting and there's a whole lot of things being talked about and it seems like it doesn't fit, I encourage you to use this question. Just say, what are we trying to accomplish? And if the room goes silent, then you know that we might have gone off track. We might need to refocus. It's a quick little strategy to use, but it also focuses back on like, what are our true goals? I'll jump down to then the strategies one. The other question is, what change can we make that will result in an improvement? And this is some of that ideation, the activities work of like all these things that we can do that can achieve the goals that we're setting out. And then finally, that question in the middle, which is related to our measures, is how will we know that the change is an improvement? So what are we capturing? What are we measuring? What are we looking at? And sometimes it might be hard data around outcome measures. Other times it's hearing from families and hearing their story and what impacted them or what changes do we need to make. And then there's an entire process at the bottom that we call a plan, do, study, act cycle. So as you're planning things, even the big planning process, you're going through that, then you start to do things based on the strategies and the goals and the measures that you're identifying. Then, and many times we do a lot of plan do's. We like do plan do cycles all along. Taking the time to study it and then make actions is actually where the continuous improvement work happens. It's actually where we get smarter about how to think about what we're doing, the impact it's having on the goals we're trying to achieve. And it gives us a process to step back a little bit and reflect, so we're not always planning and doing. We can go to the next slide. And I like to put this one out there, and I'll let this sink in a little bit. But all improvement requires change, but not all change is an improvement. And I'm sure you've been in places where you're making a lot of change. And sometimes the change actually complicates the system because we didn't think about all of the connections and how something new introduced may actually conflict with something else. And it may actually create something that's even more complex. So while we have to make change to get an improvement, making the right changes and understanding if those changes are actually resulting in the improvements we desire is absolutely critical. So, and that's where the study and act piece, really understanding and asking the questions of, is this actually working or is it not? So you can go to the next slide. I'm gonna have you drop in the chat one of these three. So there are these three conditions of preconditions for managing some of this change. Number one is data access. Number two, diverse voices. And then number three, a process for improvement. I want you to think about your own work at your community school and your change management process and how you've been operating. And which of these three are you best at? Is it the data access? Is it the diverse voices? Or is it the process for improvement? So take a couple seconds, think about it, drop it in the chat. I'm really curious to see which ones begin to pop up. I see diverse voices. Diversity in voice. Diversity in voice. Ooh, some data access, two of them, another diverse voices. Process, all right, we've got a process person. Diverse voices again, process for improvement. Give a couple more seconds to see what pops up. Process for improvement, process for improvement. Oh, great. So we do have people who are really looking at process. Excellent. So these are also people who you might want to cue off of, those process improvers versus those data geeks versus those people who are like really good at engaging diverse voices. And all three of these are important. I think understanding though what you're really good at as a school also helps you to identify what are the capacities that you need for the others. So if you're good at diverse voices, but we really don't have a process for collecting or analyzing our data, like that becomes really critical because we can have a lot of diverse voices at the table. The unfortunate thing is diverse voices might cause us diverse solutions without any type of understanding of the outcomes or if it's actually improving what we wanted to do. And then the process for improvement, I think, having those processes actually allows for the other things to happen. So while you might have a great process, being able to connect the voices then to help make change along the way, and then also the data access is really critical. You can go to the next slide. Thank you for sharing that, everyone. So I'm going to take each one of these in just in little segments, and please feel free to drop into the chat if you have questions, you want to stop me. I'm happy to answer anything as we go. From the data access perspective, there's a little statement that we like to use a lot in improvement work, is that you cannot improve what you cannot measure. So we might have some of the best ideas and things in place, but if we can't measure it, we actually can't improve it. We can't go through the process of really learning about what we're doing and how to get even better at it. And actually, it might actually stunt your growth because you aren't able to see some of the nuances of what you're doing. And the other thing that I always suggest is for those people who are not necessarily great at data and getting data access or even partnerships with other organizations, we're helping them to do that, is to start with something that already exists. So what exists at your school that is readily available? And many times your basic attendance, your achievement, your engagement, those exist. They may, they may be more difficult to get your hands on, even in the way that you want them to be available or to really analyze it, but start with those things and begin to cut them apart in different ways of looking at, like, who are those attendance issues, what are some nuances within that data that can help us. And even as we go over to the right side of that slide, we might need to segment the population in different ways, where we're looking at certain students who we're trying to target, and then looking at both, measures that we already have, understanding kind of like what is the combination of the problem that's occurring with those, and how might we then design solutions that are helping to support the growth. And then the other two are really interesting to me, and I've seen schools begin to start thinking about this, and it's started entirely new conversations. But the first one is process reliability. So like, as you're putting new processes in place, do you know that they're actually working in sequence the way you'd want them to work? And then finally, this quality of the change. So how good is the change? Is it actually working? And is it a high quality, or is it kind of that minimal thing, like it's getting some of our outcomes? And there's a difference here that we want to explore between accountability versus improvement measures. And I'll go kind of quickly introduce this. And it's something to reflect on as you're thinking about the data that you have access to and what you really need. If you go to the next slide, our accountability data is usually our end of the line. So it's sometimes that goal data, or it's like end of the year academic or attendance data that we report to the state or a district, or we judge our school by. Improvement data is different because it's data that we're collecting along the way for learning. And what that might look like is something that it's closely aligned to the change that we're making. So it might be information, if we're making a change around after school programs, we're collecting the information around how many students are attending. Even at basic level, just attendance at that after school program. Even what are children saying about, about what's happening there. Those are all process measures that can help us learn more about the new things that we're introducing. The other one is that it should be embedded. So we're collecting it then from the source. It's not like it has to be fed into a big system or anything else. I've seen teachers and schools do this with just like paper pencil tally marks, and sometimes like the low tech solution on improvement measures is actually good. And then the final piece is that we want to use this to build trust amongst our staff, amongst our community, so that we're sharing this type of information around enrollment in after school programs, how kids are accessing, or families are accessing resources that we're putting in place, all with the intent to get better, to ask the questions of, was that good enough? Or what would it take to get 2 times the number of people enrolled in this? Or what process do we need to put in place to expand that? So if you go to the next slide, I'll shift gears a little bit. And I think this is where, community schools, we really focus on this, which is the diverse voices. So getting the names, getting the individuals engaged in the work. And I think Angela and Jeanette did a good job of talking about, who and why are those individuals connected. And, it's not just about having more, it's about having the right diverse voice. I think one kind of key concept from the diverse voices is that each person really has a unique insight into the system, and they see the system from a different vantage point. So someone who's a teacher or a parent or a community partner or even a student sees what is needed or sees how something is put in place from a totally different area. And even just having those conversations with them around how they might make changes to that is critical in any type of continuous improvement work. If you go to the next one, there's also this process for improvement. And Edwards Deming, and yes, old white guy, who is kind of the father of improvement, both in business, but then also is translated into healthcare, so that if you can't describe your work as a process, you don't know what you're doing. And I think that has resonated for me, especially within community schools. We might be doing a lot, but if we can't talk about the steps in that, then we might not fully understand what's happening. So I'm going to begin to pull all of this together. And also with our process for improvement, we use that PDSA process to manage the change, where we're planning a small change, we're predicting what we think will happen. I think that's really key in any type of work that you're doing. You're not just saying, hey, let's make this change, let's put the strategy or thing in place, but actually sit back and predict, what do we think it's going to happen? What's going to happen if we do it? What is it going to increase? What is it going to decrease? How will people engage with it? Putting your predictions out there makes you confront the reality when we have data to tell us about what happened. And basically, once you've predicted and planned, you go out and do it, collect that information, study what happened, and then make an action. So we talk about an improvement work as adapting, adopting, and abandoning, but also you can think about it as like, do we continue this? Do we change it in some way? Or should we start something new? Or should we just stop this entirely? Like, this doesn't work. Let's put it to the side. Let's start something new. But we learned a whole lot from it. And I think those questions, once you've done some work for a while, being able to step back and reflect on that, do that study and acting is key to any type of work that we're doing around continuous improvement. So if you go to the next slide, right, I want to talk a little bit about routines and a cadence of work. So in schools, we have so much going on. Again, we have that complexity. We needed those preconditions. And then there's actually the process that's many times is not spelled out in our plan. It's actually, how do we go about doing it? So how do we facilitate learning cycles? When do we meet with teams? When do we collect and analyze and display data? And then, you know, who's facilitating these data conversations? And what are we trying to answer when we pull these together? And then finally, how do we consolidate learning after doing things for a while and adapt our plan, whether we're adapting, adopting, abandoning, or we're continuing something, we're making a change, we're starting something new, we're going to stop something. All of these routines are critical, and understanding who's on your team, what data we're bringing to the table, what questions we're trying to answer. And all of this seems great and it's all theoretical, but I want to show you what it looks like in reality. So if you go to the next slide, I think key to this work is actually thinking about your work in segments. What are different action periods between meetings? So every time you come together as a planning team or as a smaller work group or whatever those structures look like at your site, there's usually a time period in between. And you know, the meetings are really critical, kind of bookending those action periods that have real distinct work. That's where you plan something and you're actually doing it. So that's the do part. And if you're meeting on each side, you may have action periods that are spread out. Maybe it's a monthly meeting like this, but between August and September, they're doing two things in this group. They're collecting and analyzing and displaying data, and they're facilitating a data conversation. So they're really looking at the data up front to understand what is happening. And then they're going through another action period, possibly meeting. This time they didn't have data, but then the next time they're going deep again on that data and making adjustments. So each one of the meetings actually is not just a report out on what we did. It's actually a time for us to look at and ask the questions of, was the change that we made an improvement, going all the way back to the model for improvement that I shared with you earlier. And if you go to the next slide, there's a really key piece. Once you've done a couple cycles or a couple meetings, it's really important to take a step back, consolidate the learning, write it down, think about it, and make any actions or bigger adjustments at that point in time. So if you go to we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to give you a school example. So I gave you the theory. Are there any questions right now about kind of what I'm sharing or things that didn't make sense that I can address before I jump into an example? And you're free to come off mic too if that's easier. All right. Well, I'm going to jump into this school example. So this is a high school. They had a problem that they identified as part of their work, that students in 9th grade, they fail English 1. So they're like English level for that grade. We call it English 1, where I've taught. and they don't have enough credits to move to the 10th grade. So this failure of English 1 creates a huge barrier in credit accumulation. And we've actually seen over time in some districts that I've worked in where this one failure creates a waterfall effect. If you fail this, you may fail the next thing. You may have an attendance issue, and it just waterfalls through. There are also some indicators that we started to identify with kids who fail that they aren't necessarily coming to school prepared. They may have struggled also in middle school, or they're transitioning to a new school without some of their friends, so they weren't necessarily in a feeder pattern to a school, so they're entirely coming into 9th grade, you know, as almost a new school for them. And those kids, all of those things display a different amount of risk for that child who is going to be failing. And there's some information here about, you know, previous years. In 2016, they had 24% of their entire 9th grade class who was failing. It's a small school, about 120 students, but 32 students failed English 1. In 2017, 30 students did, so it pretty much stayed the same. In 2018, we had 41 students who had failed that, so the numbers went up. So this school came together and said, let's identify our goal. Basic planning process that Angelo and Jeanette shared. We want to have a goal, at least for this part of it, is to reduce the number of students failing by 50% in 1 year. So go from 40 students to 20 students. And they identified some different places to focus. We want to, early on in the school year, identify students who we think might fail. Now, they're not guaranteed failures. We're probably going to identify kids who may just be fine, but we want to identify those kids who might be at risk. And we have to think about a couple of different measures. Provide mentoring. We have a mentoring program that we work with. They're in the community. We want to connect with them more intentionally about those kids, because possibly in the past, they were just mentoring different students, but they weren't identified by the school. They weren't connected and facilitated to be able to engage. And then finally, we also want to put some instructional interventions in place from our individual school. So on the next kind of level here is even a more detailed grain size of kind of the plans that they were putting together. So analyzing patterns of student failures that can be used to identify possible students, establish some on-track benchmarks. So by middle of the year, what are we looking at as an on-track benchmark? What would we expect that? Is it a C average, or is it something else, or is it an attendance metric? So beginning to establish some of those kind of data points along the road that we want to see if kids are on track. And they don't have to be, you know, they don't have to be every single benchmark. It doesn't have to be everything that's, you know, that research tells us. It's kind of what are those things that we think would allow us to identify those kids are on track, because we're also trying to learn. And then another piece that they started identifying was we need to communicate better to students and parents the expectations of them. So when they had conversations with students who failed in the past, some of that was that they just didn't understand until it was too late. And then I mentioned before the partnering with an organization, and then developing instructional interventions to accelerate learning at the school. But for this example, if you go to the next slide, we're going to focus really on this communication piece of students and parents and expectations as a real key leverage point within the system, as well as connecting them to these programs. But that piece is critical. And you know, when you start drawing a line from an activity or a strategy like that to multiple other areas where that one has a relationship to the identification of students, it also has a relationship to the instructional interventions. It's also connected to the mentoring piece. So that whole communication effort around this seems to be one that's extremely critical in this entire process. So if you go to the next slide, this school began work really with that cadence that I talked about before. So starting in the summer and beginning to establish an understanding of who those students were. So they pulled together a team, diverse voices, parents, teachers, community, mentoring organization, their administration. They looked at data from previous years and started to create a plan of what that might look like. And what they found through some of that data down in the bottom right was that parents were unaware of the expectations that's for students, and some of those students who didn't pass had poor attendance. So it was kind of a combination of not understanding and then also not attending, and we weren't looking at it as a combination of things. Secondly, the next piece, then in September, they had identified 60 of 120 students. They identified half the population who may be at risk. and enrolled students collaborated to really get enrollment up in their mentoring program. And so they enrolled 42 students in mentoring and then continued with that process, kind of looking at who's attending, who's not. And in January, they took a step back, looked at who is performing, who is not, and 18 had below a C average. And then of those students, 10 missed 20 days or more. And of those 10, only 3 were enrolled in the mentoring program. So the mentoring program seemed to be helping kids get in and stay in school and engaging, but it wasn't helping, but there are a lot of kids who are falling through the cracks. And so then the focus became not on all 60, it became on those who were currently enrolled, keeping it going, but then also enrolling the additional 18 to make sure that they are supported. And like that type of analytics, it's not big data, it's actually this small information, but really targeted in discussions that are kind of created around it that help them choose what the next strategy was, what the next plan was. And then, at the end of the year, they took a step back, looked at what happened, and only 8 out of 120 students failed English 1. So a reduction by 80% of those students. And from that point on, part of the consolidation process was actually looking at what does the process look like. So if you go to the next slide, the process actually began to come up into kind of a step-by-step sequence of exactly what they did. They reviewed data, they identified students who may be at risk, they communicated the expectations, they enrolled students, and they got to these checkpoints and asked the question, are students attending? And if they were, then great, we'll keep going. If not, we need to do something else. So they would meet with the student individually, talk with them, they may enroll them in the program, and that process kind of went along with different checkpoints. Cool thing about this is that you're building a system that can be replicated year after year. When someone asks you, well, what did you do to accomplish those goals? Then you can actually say, well, here's what we did. Here's the steps. This also helps us that as you start doing it, you might see that, oh yeah, that step doesn't work. We need to move on from that step and make an adjustment somewhere else. So this is that whole piece that Deming was talking about around if you can't explain your work in a process, you don't know what you're doing. So I encourage you to take, as you're beginning to map things out, begin to plan out and put things in process. And I'm going to go to the chat. I see Maria say, as a classroom teacher who was transitioned to community school engagement work, I think that a complete analysis of the situation, however, must include the instruction. What is being taught? How are students being assessed? Is the curriculum assessment rooted in equity? Absolutely. So I totally agree with that. So there's also what you're doing is starting to look at, like, what are all of those factors, both in school. I focused on just this other piece, but that one also is really important in looking at the entire system of what's producing the outcome. And if you go to your next slide, this is what Angelo had queued up for me. So there, as you go through this process, there's so much work to be done. And one principle that I want to introduce to you, something that's been used in healthcare and in business for many years, and I think in education, we're just beginning to realize some of this, and that is the Pareto principle. And basically it's an 80-20 rule. But if you think about all of the work that you do within a year or within a day or within a week, about 80% of the time that you're expending is probably on trivial tasks. It's on email, it's on other communication structures. It's valuable information, but it may only, the time that you're spending possibly only results in 20% of the result. Whereas there are some few vital tasks that you're doing, possibly even like these meeting structures or really deep analysis of the work that could help us to identify what to do, that would allow us, we would spend fewer minutes, a less amount of time on it, but it would create a bigger result. So our challenge then is beginning to identify what are those few vital tasks and how can we do more of it. If we go to the next slide, that prioritization matrix is actually really important. So as you're starting to put together all of these strategies, just like Angelo had shared, like you can actually just put dots on the map of like, here's a strategy. How does it relate to impact and effort? Is it high or low impact? And you can define that internally however you want. I think it's sometimes better for you to define what is low and high effort or high or low impact, and then just plop on this map where each one of these falls. And our challenge here is actually figuring out what are those great things to start with, or the early wins. How can we maximize our impact with the least amount of effort? If you go to the next slide, we'll just highlight that one right there. These are the great opportunities. These are the things that if you're looking to build support for an initiative, you want to do a lot of these things that are high impact, low effort, that you can show outcomes on. And then the next one, if you go to the next slide, our next challenge is actually taking the things that are in that low impact but low effort and trying to move them up. How can activities be moved from this low impact area to a high impact? And so maybe that's about the, how many, the scale of what we're doing, where it's still low effort, but we might be able to scale it a little bit faster if we know that it's working. And what are the resources that might help to get it there? And then the next one, finally, is actually looking at the ones that are good. So they're high effort, we're putting a whole lot of time into it, but they're also getting a huge return. And the critical piece of this is actually some of that process work of how do we get more efficient? How do we take the things that are working really well, and are there efficiencies that we can create that can still get us the same high impact, but with less effort? How do we work smarter, but not harder? So as your teams are putting things onto a prioritization map like this, how do you go about identifying those ones that are in good and weak and having the conversation about moving them to the center of great? And if you go to the next slide, we are actually going to take a few minutes. I don't think I have a full 10 minutes, but I think I want to break out for about 5 minutes into your teams and have you have a few minutes just to talk about what I shared, how it has implications on what you're doing inside your buildings, and then also connecting it to the logic model. So are there other inputs or actions that you might consider now that you're thinking about what Angelo presented and now what I'm sharing around the continuous improvement? What structures need to be created to manage the work, which is sometimes where things fall apart in implementation? And then finally, are there actions that you would prioritize and why? And so I'll give you about 5 minutes to start this conversation, and then we'll come back. I'm gonna ask for 2 or 3 people to share and some other people to put like one thing in the chat. So Deanna, if you...
We're going to do a similar process as we did before. You should currently be in the breakout rooms that you were in the last session. So I'm going to open the rooms right now. Please just join your room when you see it pop up. Looks like people are moving along.
Jeanette, I'm having trouble again. This is Rosa. It comes up and then it disappears.
Okay, let's see. You're there. I'm going to move you to the main room, and then, or maybe not.
Sounds good. Whatever works. I tried to join and it just went nowhere.
Are you on a Mac?
I am.
Yeah. Can you leave the room that you're in? Can you see anything or no?
I can leave. I have a leave. I don't know what I'm leaving, but I'll leave.
Go ahead and leave and then rejoin. Oh, except for I think that was like leave all the way, which was not the plan.
Jared, that was so great.
It was good. I like that.
And Angelo and Danette, as always. And then Jose is here. So he'll start once we close the breakout rooms, bring everyone back, right, Greg?
Yep.
Okay.
Could you pop me into West Mesa this time?
Yeah, so maybe where was your last room?
Van Buren.
Van Buren, okay, thanks.
Great presentation, Jared.
Thanks.
I love the way you talk about the prioritization matrix. I may borrow your approach and how to talk about it. It's great.
How's it going, Jose?
What's going on, old friend?
Good to see you.
Yeah, Jared, great job. I love the Pareto principle.
Well, thanks. it actually helps people to just take a step back and think differently about how they're even doing work. So like, is the effort that they're putting in sometimes actually resulting in the outcomes that they want to see? Or is their time better spent in a different way? I mean, I think this is where the complexity comes in. Sometimes the work that we're doing isn't always the right work. And I love the chats too around the kind of queuing up the institutional racism conversation, because like, you know, this is the biggest challenge of our educational system, is that we are not set up for equity.
So we are moving into the final session of this summit, the culmination of everything that we've covered, and just I'm going to pause and just summarize some of the things that we've seen. We've looked at the logic model. We've looked at how we begin that process of school strategic planning in our schools, and then we've also connected it to knowing to that understanding that it's continuous. The work that we started today is work that we are going to be continuing on. That logic model isn't just something that we place in the shelf, it's something that we're going to continually build upon. And so as we transition into our final presenter, I'd like to welcome and introduce Jose Munoz, the director of the Coalition for Community Schools, and he is the interim president of IEL. And he's done an incredible work both here in New Mexico and nationally for community schools across this country. So let's just welcome Jose to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg, and nice to see you. Nice to see everybody on the call. Some for very familiar faces and names I see in the participants list, and some very new faces and names on the participant list. Nonetheless, it's always good to talk to my New Mexico people here. For those of you who are new to me and don't know me as well, my name is Jose Munoz, as Craig just talked about. I am the director for the Coalition for Community Schools. And so just a little bit about the Coalition. We're actually an alliance, much like you do at the school level. We're an alliance of hundreds of local, state, and national partners, intermediaries, that actually advocate for more community schools. So some of the things that you're feeling is a result of our community school council, I would say, as a vehicle. We advocate for this as a vehicle. We really want to unite the schools and families and communities so that all of our young people, all of them, every single one of them, for their well-being and for their prosperity as well, too. So much like you all are working at a local neighborhood level or even at a community-wide level, we're working at a national level. I would say I'm the coordinator for that for the unions, School-Based Health Alliance, After School Alliance, some of the organizations that do community schools, nonprofits, and community-based organizations and grassroots organizations, as well as some of our political figures, members of Congress. I get a chance to rub elbows a little bit with them as well, too. So that's a little bit about the coalition here, and it's awesome to see that New Mexico coming together, and you all are just evolving community school work across the country. For those of you who don't know, now I live in Albuquerque. I was in DC for a short period as I took on this new role of mine, but during one of the good things that came out of the pandemic was that my board of directors said it was okay if I worked remotely. So I took advantage of that as fast as I can. So yeah, I'll have to travel back to DC every now and then, but home right here in New Mexico. So that really feels good for me. I know you started the conversation yesterday. Was it yesterday, I guess it was, with Monique. Am I correct on there? Monique Mills?
It was this morning.
Oh, it was this morning. This morning. Okay. So I gotta say, to put Manzano Mesa, not to brag about you, Deanna, or Manzano Mesa too much, but speaking of the coalition, when I was local in Albuquerque working on community schools, I got a chance to really get to know Monique a little bit. And It was 2014. We're 67 of us were actually went to the Coalition for Community Schools National Conference in Cincinnati. And it was during that meeting, that conference, when Monique came back and she realized, it's like, hey, I actually go to a community school. Why don't I ask for help myself? So she was participating in so much into giving back to her local community, the yes on her heart, as folks may have heard said during this last 2 days, as a parent of students at her local school. Monique actually needed the support of her local school as well too. I was thinking about today when I was asked by Greg and to actually come and speak to you all around community schools. I can't help, there's a story that among the hundreds of stories I get a chance now, especially nationally, to hear and to actually witness in local communities as I've traveled around. There's a story that sticks in my head and in my heart when we talk about the purpose, the why of community schools. Memorial Day 2015, I had received a call from Deanna about a tragedy that just happened to a family at her school. That Memorial Day weekend, a father who's a professional and is a tree cutter, and he operated cranes all the time. He decided to take his sons and his neighbor up into the crane, and just as he has probably done dozens and dozens of time as a professional. But it was on that day, that Memorial 2015, that crane, a wind came through as it does in Albuquerque and blew that crane that was 60 feet up in the air down. Now that father and his 12-year-old son died instantly in that crash as they put themselves between 3 other small children who were in that crane. I got a chance to go to the hospital, the 7-year-old son, and I stood in the intensive care unit. They allowed me to go back, and I stood across that 7-year-old who was laying on the table with his complete body cavity open right at this point, and across from the mom. And forgive me if I get choked up a little bit, but across from the mom, and she spoke Spanish and I don't. We had no means really of verbally communicating with each other, but we were communicating as I felt her pain and she felt my desire to just be there. And that young boy, 7-year-old, later died in the hospital. They had another daughter who was at home, teenager at that time, and another son who was in the hospital and hurt, and a neighbor who was in critical condition as well. Why does this matter when I talk about community schools and you hear something as tragic as that happening? Because it's really about the purpose of community school. At that school, they connected regularly. 7:45 in the morning, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even earlier, ended at 7:45 in the morning every other week. They had a chance to connect there. From that, they had to plan the desires of their heart and address the needs that they faced at that meeting of family members and community members coming together on a regular basis. They saw each other in small groups, community groups, through developing things like homework diners and preschool co-ops and other activities that they had at the school where they met and talked regularly. It was that vehicle, that engine of coming together frequently, working together through hard problems that they face every day, and working together to build things that their hearts desired together, from the principal to the teachers to the community members to the parents, and even some of the youth getting involved. They worked together as they taught their kids how to read. They taught their kids how to play. They worked with each other in the community. it was that vehicle that supported that mom during that time, that tragedy that her family was going through. There was 24/7 watch of her teenage daughter, and there was 24/7 watch of her son, her other son, who was also in the hospital and recovering as she stood next to her 7-year-old. There was 24/7 meals applied for their family from that community. It's the purpose of a community school, you see, is for us to build community, as the word says. People often go straight to our last name, but when people get to know me, they say Jose. So here, when we really get to know community and get to know each other and build community, we start emphasizing the first name of community school, and we begin to build and we begin to move towards getting to know what that first name looks like. And I described a little bit what that meant in that case and how that played out. Now, today, the survivors of that accident that I found out, I got a chance to find out today. Thank you, Deanna, as I was putting my mind right so I wouldn't just be sobbing on the screen right now, getting my mind right as I knew I was going to tell this story and relive this story. That still hurts me today, but still gives me such hope and promise of where we're going as a movement. Because that mom today is doing well. That young son of theirs who was severely hurt recovered. He was 10 years old now, and I hear now is doing well in high school. But that mom still stays connected with her children gone from the elementary school they're at, still stay connected to the friends. Listen to that word, the friends that she developed by just creating a vehicle where people come together, connect, where they collaborate and work together, where they communicate frequently together. They were able to build a friendship that is enduring, where a young man who experienced such tragedy was part of it, falling down that crane and seeing his father, his older brother, and his younger brother pass from this, a scene where first responders called the most horrific scene they've ever came upon. This young man now doing well in high school. That's the power and the purpose. You see, whether you're a principal or a coordinator or a teacher, whoever's on this call right now, when you think about this community school, you think about the power that that building can have in facilitating this type of bond and relationship. You begin to use it differently. You begin to look at the data differently. It's not data to make our school look good where people will come here and I get a good evaluation. This is the data that we look at to find out who's hurting, who's missing, what's their story that I need to find out. How do I engage them on a regular basis to learn what is it that they need to mitigate their struggles that they're going through? But even more importantly, what is it they desire so they don't stay stuck for their children, their grandchildren to do better? Then we start seeing kids, and I can point to example after example across the country now in this role. And I can do it in New Mexico as well too. And some of you have witnessed it yourselves. So we talk about community schools. Community schools isn't just about wraparound services. It's not about giving stuff to people. It's not about managing the mess they're in now, or we're all in. It's about building community. It's about righting wrongs, whether they were intentional or unintentional, that have been created in our society to actually achieve the social justice that we're all looking for. When I look at an attendance score, I don't think about how to improve attendance scores. I'm thinking about what's causing them not to come. Is it the way I'm treating them? Is it something going on in their households? Are they just busy? We have to look at this type of data differently if we're going to build something that lasts. And the thing that we want to build that lasts, we as professionals, here's the hard part, may not ever see it. When I was starting off early in my career in Las Vegas, Nevada, I have to clarify that for you New Mexicans, for us New Mexicans, Las Vegas, Nevada, I did a lot of community organizing around juvenile justice issues, around gang issues that the city was enduring during that time. You see, when I lived in Las Vegas, it was the same size as Albuquerque. Back then, actually smaller. It was about 500,000 people who lived in Las Vegas at that time. And then they started building these big old mega casinos. And the mega casinos brought lots of young people from the Chicagos, the Los Angeleses, the Houstons, the Atlantas, the Mississippis, you name it. We weren't experiencing gang problems, and then what we took was when things weren't available for them to build relationship with their local neighborhoods, they began to actually fulfill self-fulfilling prophecies from the neighborhoods they came from. We didn't give them a different prophecy. We were just letting them be and attend stuff, attend school, attend after school program, attend a health clinic. They weren't doing anything to build community. When we started bringing people together and designing what their community should be like, we began to see the data change. We saw juvenile detention centers lose their enrollment. We saw school buildings begin to be populated. Heck, you can go to Fremont Street now, and I can tell you the story of how it developed from 1996, from that community's desire and their dreams of what that would look like. And they built out circle upon circle upon circle. That's sustainability, building something that will last beyond us. Community schools is a regenerative design approach. Generation after generation should feel welcome when they come into our school buildings. They are capable of designing their own future. Who's the onus on? It's on us. How do we create the space? You want to do continuous improvement? You look back at its roots from Toyota. When they talk about Six Sigma's roots, I should say, Toyota, you can't do continuous improvement in a business without engaging all your employees if you want to do it right. Why would you think it'd be different in a neighborhood? If you want a neighborhood to improve, you want your test scores to improve, you want your attendance to improve, you want your behaviors to change, you got to include the people who actually impact the numbers. That's how you look at data. Then you dig deeper, and I promise you, you're going to find a social justice issue. When it came to attendance or student mobility, we eventually learned that there were some wrongful evictions happening. It's because of the community schools that informed the policies and practices that flipped that number around, and it's still working on that. So I guess my main point I want to give you is maybe some practical steps to take before I exit off this call, is get to know the first name. Dig into community. Use your data to point you in the direction of who to engage. Start planning from there. Yes, you're smart professionals. You come across many people. You've heard many stories. Yeah, me too. But I got to test my hypothesis. I got to ask the people who are in it right now if I want to make a change right now. You want to accelerate your outcomes. You do that. You engage them and you meet frequently. Those coordinators on the call right now, and Deanna and Danette, know that I lost out on one thing I desired to do. I wanted every coordinator to meet every week. You guys remember those conversations? Why? Because that's how relationships happen. Continuous engagement. But I know they meet every other week now in Albuquerque. I think they do. But there's so many other venues and outlets like I described that mom had where she connected with folks on a regular basis. So create smaller communities inside your large community of a school and get to know and get to build what community schools are. And that's community. And you'll see the numbers change. I want to thank you all for all the work that you're doing in New Mexico. I use New Mexico as an example to the rest of the country and even other countries from around the world as they inquire about community schools. I want you to know that this movement is greater than any one of us on this call right now, greater than even me as the national director. It's on a presidential platform. There's at least 8 states with policy plus the District of Columbia looking for money. It's going to be one of the most argued things during the next election because we're not going to stop because it's just that important. You want to inform policy, bring your community together and learn what the policy it is that needs to be informed and then how to inform it. You'll make that change. You'll stabilize positions. That'll tell you even people who wanted to fire me couldn't, even if I wasn't in the mix, just because just included people. That's the simple thing you could do as a school leader is just include people in the conversation, quantify it. I talked to this many people and this is what they said. So I think I should move my money that way. It makes sense, doesn't it? Do the thing that makes sense. Get to know your community. I really appreciate all you all. We're not the Coalition for Community Schools. We all are. You all are. So I want to thank you all for being part of the coalition as well too. Thank you for asking me, Greg, Deanna, Danette, and all my friends on the call as well. And good to see Angelo. We go way back in the ABC movement too. So good to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. That's just wonderful, wonderful way to end this powerful 2-day summit on shared collaborative leadership. There are just so many people to thank in the wrapping up of this discussion. I want to thank the entire coalition team. People that were part of the planning, Angelo Gonzalez, Amanda Barella, Julia Bergen, Lindsay Wilwall, Jared Bolte, Dave Greenberg, Megan Munoz, Danette Townsend, and Deanna Garcia. We also had a lot of really important people at PED that were part of the planning stages, the earlier planning stages. I want to thank Deputy Secretary Kata Sandoval, Dr. Ryan Stewart for speaking and lending his support. Deputy Secretary Tim Hand also lent his support behind this. Feliz Ortiz and Mara Trejo, without them, it would have just been very difficult to put all this together. I also want to thank APS leadership. Scott Elder has been very supportive of the School Ambassador Fellowship Program. Thank people that I've been able to speak with, including Amanda DeBell and Brian Garcia, had many conversations about the community school framework with him. I want to thank everybody from the U.S. Department of Education who's been on and have lent their support. Ormond Ferez, Abel McDaniels, you saw him earlier today. Elsa Nash, he presented. Cynthia O'Brien and Dr. Hale, Brian Hale, 2 of my U.S. Ed supervisors in DC. I want to thank them. And I also really want to thank all the presenters. Everything that we discussed today is going to be useful in pulling together from diversity of voices, data, and that improvement process. All these things aren't just in a nutshell. In talking about that, I'm putting a survey link in the chat box, and I'll also be sending this out. We really want to know feedback, what sessions were useful to you, what were your largest takeaways, and also what would you like to see next? Would you like to see this continued next year? So please put your feedback in the survey, and we'll also be sending that out. All the presentations that you saw today from Jared and Angelo, those resources will be sent out in an email as well. And of course, the logic model that Andrea Quintana was able to present and just really introduce. Feel free to take those resources and build upon them. But this has been just an incredible audience. I'm so thankful that you've entrusted us with the opportunity to lead you all in professional development, and that, just just the time that you provided in your busy, busy summers. We've managed to end 5 minutes early. Thank you all and have a wonderful, wonderful summer.